My daughter introduced me as just my mom 3 weeks before her wedding, and somehow that hurt more than becoming a widow at 36. The engagement dinner was held in a private dining room overlooking Boston Harbor, all soft candlelight and polished silverware. Everybody there looked expensive in a quiet way. The women wore cream-colored cashmere and diamond earrings small enough to whisper wealth instead of announce it. Even the wine glasses looked fragile enough to apologize for existing. I remember standing beside Sophie near the long table while she introduced me to another couple from her fiancé's family circle. "This is my mom," she said with a practiced smile. "She owns a little bakery back home. A little bakery, not the bakery that kept our lights on after my husband died. Not the bakery that paid for her college tuition. Not the bakery where I worked 16-hour days while raising her alone. Just a little bakery back home." The woman beside me smiled politely. "Oh, how quaint, quaint." I smiled back because that's what women like me do. We smooth things over. We make moments comfortable for everyone else. But later that night, while dessert plates were being cleared, Sophie's future mother-in-law laughed softly and said, "Well, at least nobody here has flour under their fingernails tonight." Everyone chuckled, even Sophie. That was the moment something inside me finally went still, not because the joke was cruel, because my daughter never looked at me once while they laughed, as if pretending not to notice would somehow protect her from belonging to me too openly. And for the first time in my life, I found myself wondering whether Sophie actually loved me anymore, or whether I had simply become part of a background she was trying to outgrow. The train ride back to Vermont felt longer than usual. Rain streaked the windows in thin silver lines while the dark countryside blurred past outside. I sat alone with my overnight bag beside me, staring at my reflection in the glass. At some point during dinner, I had scrubbed my hands so hard in the restaurant bathroom that the skin around my knuckles turned pink. I hadn't even realized I was doing it until afterward, trying to make sure there was no flour left under my nails. I closed my eyes and remembered Sophie at 7 years old, standing on a wooden stool behind the bakery counter, wearing one of my aprons nearly down to her ankles. "My mommy owns the best bakery in the whole world," she used to tell people proudly. Back then she said bakery like it meant magic. Now she said it like something she needed to explain away politely. By the time I unlocked the bakery the next morning, the sky's still dark blue with the last edge of night hanging over the river. The familiar smell of yeast and cinnamon wrapped around me the second I stepped inside. Normally, that smell comforted me. That morning, it only made me tired. I tied my apron automatically and started preparing dough before sunrise. Muscle memory took over while my mind wandered somewhere else entirely. The old jazz station played softly from the radio near the ovens. Flour dust floated through warm yellow light above the counter. Outside, Main Street stayed quiet except for the occasional truck rolling past on wet pavement. I glanced at the wall of photographs near the register. There was Sophie at 12, grinning with missing front teeth while holding a tray of burnt cookies. There was Tom behind the counter before the accident, smiling with flour on his cheek because he always kissed me before washing his hands. And there was the engagement photo Sophie mailed me 2 weeks earlier. Perfect hair, perfect lighting, perfect smile. It looked beautiful. It also looked like a photograph of strangers. The bell above the front door chimed around 6:30 when my first regular customer came in. "Morning, Maggie," Mr. Callan said, rubbing cold hands together. "Smells like heaven in here." "Morning, Frank. The usual?" "You already know." I handed him his coffee before he even reached for his wallet. That was the thing about small towns. People let you become part of their routines, their grief, their celebrations, their ordinary Tuesdays. For years I thought that was enough. By 8 o'clock the bakery had filled with familiar voices and the sound of ceramic mugs clinking against tabletops. I moved between customers automatically, remembering everyone's orders before they spoke. Then Mrs. Porter smiled warmly while packing muffins into her purse and said, "Your daughter must be so proud of everything you built here." I froze for half a second too long. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think she is." But even saying it felt strangely uncertain. Around 10, Arthur Bennett wandered in carrying snowdamp leaves on the shoulders of his coat. He'd been coming to the bakery for years, ever since retiring from teaching music at the high school. He studied my face longer than usual while I poured his coffee. "You look exhausted," he said gently. "Long trip yesterday, the engagement dinner?" I nodded. "And how was it?" The automatic answer rose to my lips instantly. "Lovely." Arthur didn't respond right away. He just stirred cream into his coffee slowly. Then he looked up and asked quietly, "Did you enjoy yourself? Or did you behave yourself?" Something in my chest tightened so suddenly I had to look away. Because the worst part was, I understood exactly what he meant. The next morning, I found one of Sophie's old drawings wedged behind a stack of recipe binders in the office upstairs. The paper had yellowed around the edges, and someone, probably me, had folded it carefully in half years ago to keep it from tearing. In crooked purple crayon letters it read, "My mommy owns the best bakery in the whole world." Underneath the words was a drawing of me standing behind the counter wearing an apron almost as big as my body. Sophie had drawn a giant smile on my face and hearts floating around cinnamon rolls. I sat there staring at that piece of paper while rain tapped softly against the bakery windows downstairs. Funny how grief works. Sometimes it doesn't arrive like a storm. Sometimes it's just a child's handwriting, suddenly reminding you there was a time somebody looked at you like you hung the moon. Tom died on a Thursday in November. Cold rain, wet roads, construction accident outside Burlington. People told me afterward that I handled it well. What they meant was, I didn't fall apart loudly enough to make anyone uncomfortable. Sophie was 6 years old when I stood in our tiny kitchen 3 days after the funeral trying to figure out how to explain overdue electric bills to a child who still slept with stuffed animals. I remember staring at the final notice on the counter while cartoon pancakes burned in a frying pan because my mind simply stopped working for a minute. Then, Sophie walked in rubbing her eyes and asked if we could still make cinnamon bread that weekend, like we always did, and I smiled. "Of course we can, sweetheart." Because mothers become actresses the moment survival enters the room. I went back to work the following Monday before my body was ready, before my heart was ready, before I even understood what widowhood actually meant. Every morning, I woke up around 3:30 while Sophie slept upstairs. I baked bread until sunrise, packed school lunches, worked the front counter all day, then stayed after closing doing bookkeeping until my eyes blurred. There were nights I fell asleep sitting upright in the office chair. Nights I cried quietly while kneading dough, because I knew nobody could afford for me to stop. But Sophie never knew how close we came sometimes. She never knew there were winters I skipped dinner because groceries needed stretching. She never knew I sold my wedding ring for 6 months to cover her school tuition deposit. And she definitely never knew there were evenings I sat on the kitchen after she went the kitchen floor to sleep, wondering whether exhaustion itself could kill a person. I didn't tell her because that wasn't the deal. The deal mothers make with their children is simple. I will carry the fear so you can grow up feeling safe. The bakery phone rang around noon, pulling me back into the present. I wiped flour from my hands before answering. "Hey, Mum." Sophie's voice sounded distracted, like she was walking somewhere while talking. "Hi, sweetheart. Sorry I haven't called. Things are insane right now." "That's okay." I could hear traffic in the background. Car horns, fast footsteps. Boston sounded exhausting. "We finalized the floral design," she said. "And I found this amazing designer for the menus. That sounds beautiful. Also," she hesitated, "are you still using that old bakery logo?" I glanced automatically toward the faded sign painted by Tom nearly 30 years ago, the little golden wheat stalks, the chipped lettering, the flourishes he insisted made it look European. "Yes," I said slowly. "Why?" "Well, Sophie laughed lightly. It's just kind of outdated. I could help modernize it if you want. Something about the way she said modernize made my stomach tighten. Not because the logo mattered that much, because she sounded like she was talking about a business problem instead of something built by two people who once loved each other enough to survive on almost nothing. That's sweet of you, I said carefully. You'd probably attract a different clientele. Different. There was that word again. After we hung up, I stood alone in the kitchen, longer than necessary, staring at the mixer turning in slow circles. Different clienteles, different image, different life. At the Saturday farmers market later that week, one of Sophie's co-workers recognized me near the pastry booth. "Oh my God," the woman said brightly. "You're Sophie's mother, right?" "Yes. She's amazing. Everybody at the firm loves her." Pride warmed my chest instantly. Then the woman smiled awkwardly and added, "Honestly, I never realized she came from such a humble background." Humble, the word wasn't cruel exactly, but something about the pause before it stung anyway. I smiled politely because women my age know how to survive conversations that wound us. "Well," I said softly, "there are worse things to come from than hard work." The woman laughed nervously and wandered away a moment later, but I couldn't stop thinking about it afterward. Not because strangers judged me, because Sophie had apparently allowed them to misunderstand who we were. Arthur came into the bakery just before closing, carrying a newspaper tucked under his arm. "You missed the lunch crowd," I told him. "I came for conversation, not soup." I smiled faintly and poured his coffee. He watched me quietly for a moment before saying, "You apologize a lot, Maggie." "What?" "You apologize when customers thank you. You apologize when somebody waits 30 seconds for coffee. You even apologize before giving opinions." I frowned slightly. "I'm just being polite." Arthur stirred sugar into his cup. "My ex-wife used to do something similar near the end of our marriage," he said. "Shrink herself before anybody else had the chance." That word hit me harder than it should have. Shrink. Because suddenly I saw it everywhere. The way I lowered my voice around Sophie's wealthy friends. The way I scrubbed my hands before seeing her. The way I avoided mentioning bakery stories in Boston because she seemed uncomfortable. The way I'd slowly started editing myself down into smaller, cleaner pieces. That night after closing, I went upstairs to sort through old storage boxes. Inside one of them, I found a birthday card Sophie made me years ago. "I want to grow up and be brave like you someday." I sat there on the dusty office floor holding that card while the bakery creaked softly around me in the dark. And for the first time, I allowed myself to admit something terrifying. My daughter hadn't changed overnight. This happened slowly. So slowly, I kept adjusting to each new version of distance, until one day I looked up and realized I no longer knew where I ended, and her embarrassment began. The morning Sophie called to ask me not to bring pastries to her wedding tasting, I was already awake frosting miniature lemon cakes in the bakery kitchen. It was barely 5 in the morning, and the windows were still black with night. Soft jazz played low on the radio while the smell of butter and sugar filled the air around me. I had spent 3 days testing recipes. 3 days carefully piping buttercream flowers, because Sophie used to love them as a little girl. At 8 years old, she once told me buttercream roses looked too pretty to eat. Now she sounded distracted before I could even say hello. "Mom, quick thing," she said. "You actually don't need to bring desserts to the tasting anymore." I stopped spreading frosting. "Oh?" The planner already finalized everything. I glanced down at the neat rows of cakes cooling beside me. "I thought you wanted people to try a few bakery recipes." "Well, originally, yeah. But the event has a very specific aesthetic now." Aesthetic. There was that word again, like my entire life could somehow clash with a color palette. I laughed softly to keep my voice steady. "Of course, that makes sense. It's not personal, I know." But after we hung up, I stood alone in the kitchen staring at 6 dozen tiny lemon cakes nobody needed anymore. The drive to Boston 2 days later felt heavier than usual. Rain followed me most of the way down Interstate 91, turning the highways silver beneath gray skies. By the time I reached the waterfront venue, my shoulders already ached from tension I couldn't name properly. The place looked more like an art gallery than somewhere people gathered to celebrate love. Everything was white flowers, glass walls, soft piano music, and staff members dressed so elegantly they barely seemed real. I arrived carrying nothing but my overnight bag this time. No pastries, no contribution, no visible proof of where I came from. Sophie hurried toward me in a cream-colored coat, kissing my cheek quickly before checking her phone. "You made it," she said distractedly. "You look beautiful." "Thanks. Sorry, today is a little chaotic." She was always apologizing for being busy now, like her life existed at a speed ordinary people should understand but never interrupt. Inside the tasting room, women discussed floral installations with the seriousness of military strategy. I sat quietly near the end of the table while servers brought out imported desserts so delicate they looked afraid of themselves. One of the pastries collapsed the second someone touched it with a fork. Ironically, mine would have tasted better, not that anyone there would ever know. Elaine appeared beside me halfway through the tasting wearing pearls and a smile sharp enough to slice fruit. "I do hope Sophie isn't overwhelming you with all this," she said lightly. "Oh, I'm just happy she's happy." Elaine nodded toward the room. "It's wonderful seeing how naturally she fits into this world." Something about the way she emphasized naturally made my stomach tighten. "She's worked very hard," I said carefully. "Yes, and thank goodness she was ambitious enough not to stay limited by small-town thinking." She smiled warmly after saying it. That was the terrifying thing about women like Elaine. They never sounded cruel, they sounded polished. Sophie walked over before I could answer. "Mom, did you meet Caroline?" Her family owns the vineyard hosting the rehearsal dinner. Caroline smiled politely. "Oh my goodness," she said. "So what exactly do you do back in Vermont?" Before I could answer, Sophie spoke for me. "My mom's always been really community-oriented. Community-oriented. Not business owner. Not entrepreneur. Not woman who spent 25 years building something from nothing. Just soft little phrases that made me sound harmless." I watched Sophie laugh nervously and change the subject almost immediately afterward, and suddenly I understood something I'd been trying not to admit. My daughter wasn't simply embarrassed by struggle. She was trying to translate me into something socially manageable. Later that afternoon, the wedding planner projected Sophie and Daniel's wedding website onto a large screen for final approval. Elegant photographs filled the room, their engagement story, their travel photos, their future plans. Then came the section about Sophie's background. Sophie grew up in rural Vermont before pursuing a more refined life in Boston's creative business world. Refined, I felt that word physically. There was one brief sentence about Tom's death, nothing about the bakery, nothing about years spent waking before sunrise, nothing about the place that funded every opportunity she'd ever received. But there was an entire paragraph about Daniel's family estate in Connecticut. I stared at the screen while something cold settled quietly inside my chest. Sophie wasn't just building a future, she was editing a past. I finally found her alone later near the harbor balcony outside the venue. Wind lifted strands of her hair while boats rocked gently below us in dark water. "You okay?" she asked. I looked at her carefully. "When did you stop wanting people to know where you came from?" Her expression changed instantly. "What? You talk about Vermont like it's something temporary you survived. That's not fair, isn't it?" She crossed her arms defensively. "Mom, you're reading way too much into everything lately." "Am I?" This is professional. People judge appearances. There it was again. Appearances. As if love itself needed rebranding. "You don't understand how these people see things," she said quietly. I held her gaze for a long moment. "No, sweetheart," I said softly. "I think I'm starting to." The ride home 3 days later happened through heavy rain. Halfway back to Vermont, I pulled into a gas station, and sat in the car longer than necessary staring at my hands on the steering wheel. Hands that smelled faintly like flour no matter how hard I scrubbed them. Hands that built every piece of Sophie's life. And suddenly I realized something devastating. For years, before every visit to Boston, I'd been trying to make myself look less like the woman who raised her. The award letter sat unopened on my office desk for almost 2 days before I finally forced myself to read it again. Regional Excellence in Family-Owned Business. I should have felt proud. 28 years of waking before dawn. 28 years of flour in my hair and burns on my hands and balancing invoices at midnight. But all I could think while staring at the gold lettering was how badly I still wanted to call Sophie first. Even after everything, that realization exhausted me more than the work ever had. Outside, the first real cold front of November rolled through town. The bakery windows fogged from oven heat, while wind rattled the old front sign Tom and I painted together when we first opened. I spent most of Wednesday moving through my routine and automatically. Mix dough, serve coffee, smile, clean counters. Repeat, but something inside me had shifted quietly after Boston, not dramatically, just enough to make old habits suddenly feel heavy. Around noon, Mrs. Donnelly called asking whether I could take an emergency catering order for 80 people that weekend after another bakery canceled. Normally, I would have said yes before she finished explaining. Instead, the word no almost slipped out before I caught myself. I can't this weekend, I said carefully. There was a long pause. Oh, she answered, surprised. Well, of course, dear, you deserve rest too. After we hung up, I stood frozen beside the phone. Rest. The word felt unfamiliar in my own life. That evening, for the first time in years, I left dishes in the sink overnight. It sounds ridiculous saying it out loud, but women like me measure ourselves through maintenance, through usefulness, through how little trouble we create for other people. Leaving dishes undone felt strangely rebellious. I kept glancing toward the kitchen, expecting guilt to swallow me whole. Instead, I slept 6 uninterrupted hours for the first time in months. The following morning, the local newspaper published a feature about the bakery award. By 7:30, customers were walking and carrying flowers. Maggie, this is incredible. You deserve this more than anybody. I still remember when you brought soup to my mother during this blizzard of '98. One woman started crying while telling me how I secretly delivered birthday cupcakes to her children after her husband lost his job years ago. I barely remembered doing it. That was the strange thing about survival years. You don't realize which moments become permanent in other people's lives. Arthur arrived around 10, carrying the newspaper folded under his arm. Without saying anything, he placed it gently on the counter between us. My photograph stared back at me from the front page. I hated it immediately. Why? Arthur asked calmly. I look tired. You look real. I laughed softly. There's a glamorous compliment. Arthur leaned against the counter. You know what's interesting about people who spend their lives caring for everybody else? What? They become uncomfortable the second somebody notices them. I started wiping an already clean countertop just to avoid eye contact. Recognition feels selfish after a while, I admitted quietly. Arthur studied me for a moment before speaking again. You apologize every time someone praises you, Maggie. I do not. You just did it twice during that sentence. That made me smile to spite myself. Then his expression softened. You've spent so many years trying not to inconvenience people that you started treating your own existence like something that should stay small. The words hit harder than I expected, because deep down I knew he was right. That afternoon, Sophie called while I was labeling fresh bread trays. Hey, Mom. Hi, sweetheart. I saw the newspaper article. I waited. That's amazing, she said. You never told me you entered a regional competition. There was something strange about hearing surprise in her voice, as if parts of my life had continued existing outside her awareness without permission. I mentioned it a few months ago. Oh, she paused. I must forgotten. Forgotten. I closed my eyes briefly. Not because she forgot the competition, because I suddenly realized how often I'd made excuses for moments exactly like that. Well, congratulations, she added quickly. That's really great for the bakery. For the bakery. Not for me. Before hanging up, Sophie casually asked if I'd considered updating the bakery interior before wedding guests started visiting town. Some of the decor feels a little dated, she said carefully. I stared around the kitchen. The old wooden shelves Tom built himself, the chalkboard menus, the faded photographs lining the walls. Dated or loved. That evening, Sophie drove up unexpectedly from Boston. I could tell immediately she was tense. She walked into the bakery wearing a long camel-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill, but underneath all that polish, she still looked exhausted. Thought I'd surprise you, she said. I hugged her automatically. For a second, she melted against me the way she used to after nightmares as a child. Then her phone buzzed and the moment disappeared. Over dinner at my house, she barely stopped checking emails, wedding schedules, client calls, vendor updates. At one point, she looked around the kitchen and said casually, "You know, if you opened a second location in Burlington and modernized of the branding a little, you could probably attract a wealthier crowd." I set my fork down slowly. What's wrong with the crowd I already have? That's not what I meant, but it's what you said. She sighed immediately, frustration flashing across her face. Mom, why does everything suddenly feel emotional with you lately? The room went very quiet. Outside, wind rattled the old kitchen windows while the radiator hissed softly in the corner. For years, I would have smoothed the moment over instantly. Not this time. No, Sophie, I said carefully. I think I finally stopped pretending they weren't. She blinked at me. What? I think somewhere along the way, you started treating every part of your old life like something that needed improving before other people could see it. That's not fair, isn't it? You're twisting things. I looked at my daughter across the table and saw something heartbreaking suddenly clear. She genuinely didn't understand the damage yet. Not fully. I spent my whole life trying to make sure you never felt small, I said quietly. I just didn't realize you learned how to survive by making me feel that way instead. Sophie stared at me like I'd spoken another language. And, for the first time in years, I didn't rush to rescue her from the discomfort of hearing the truth. The morning of the bakery anniversary celebration, I woke up before my alarm and lay staring at the ceiling while snow threatened the edges of the November sky outside my bedroom window. For years, mornings had belonged to survival. Get up, get moving, keep everyone fed, keep everyone comfortable. But lately, something quieter had started happening inside me. I was no longer waking up terrified of disappointing everyone before the day even began. That feeling still came sometimes, just not first anymore. By 5:30, the bakery glowed warmly against the cold, dark street outside. Volunteers from town had already started arriving, carrying folding chairs, flowers, framed photographs, and trays of food I specifically told them not to bring. You're not allowed to work your own celebration to death, Mrs. Donnelly scolded while hanging garland near the windows. I'm literally standing inside a bakery. I laughed. Work is unavoidable. But secretly, all the attention made me uncomfortable. I knew how to care for people. I had no idea how to let people care for me back. By 8 o'clock, the place was overflowing. Neighbors, former employees, old customers, people I hadn't seen in years. Someone had created a giant memory board near the coffee station filled with photographs from the bakery's history. There was Tom holding Sophie on his shoulders while painting the original sign. There was 12-year-old Sophie asleep in a booth after helping me close late during Christmas rush season. There was me at 37 with exhausted eyes and flour across my cheek, smiling anyway, because Sophie stood beside me grinning over a birthday cake. I stared at those pictures longer than I meant to. Funny how photographs preserve things you stop noticing while you're busy surviving them. Around noon, Sophie finally arrived. She stepped inside wearing a long black coat dusted with snowflakes. her expression careful and uncertain. Behind her came Daniel and Elaine. The second Sophie walked into the bakery. Conversations shifted naturally toward her. "Oh, honey, your mother practically kept this town fed during the recession. I'll never forget the winter she delivered soup to my father after his surgery. She paid my electric bill once and never told anybody." I watched Sophie's face change slowly throughout the afternoon. At first, she smiled politely the way people do during small-town nostalgia stories. Then the stories kept coming. A firefighter described how the bakery stayed open overnight during a blizzard to feed emergency crews. A young woman cried while explaining how I secretly gave her free lunches every day during high school after her mother entered rehab. An elderly widower took Sophie's hands gently and said, "Your mother saved more lonely people than she'll ever know." I noticed Sophie blinking rapidly at Frederick, like she suddenly couldn't find steady ground inside herself anymore. Because this wasn't the version of me she'd been carrying around in Boston. This wasn't quaint. This wasn't small. This was impact. Elaine stood near the coffee station, watching everything unfold with visible discomfort hidden beneath practiced smiles. At one point, I overheard someone tell her, "Maggie Hale is basically the heart of this town." And for the first time since meeting her, Elaine had absolutely nothing clever to say back. Later that afternoon, Arthur tapped his spoon gently against a coffee mug to get everyone's attention. "Oh no," I muttered immediately. "Arthur, don't you dare!" He ignored me completely. "I taught music for 40 years," he began calmly. "Which means I spent most of my life believing the loudest people in the room mattered most." Soft laughter moved through the crowd. "But age teaches you something different." He looked toward me then. "The people who hold communities together are usually the quiet ones, the women who remember birthdays, feed grieving families, stay late after everyone else leaves, the people who build places where broken folks can sit down for 15 minutes and remember they're still human." The entire bakery went silent. I looked down immediately because I could already feel tears rising. Arthur continued softly, "Some people build careers. Maggie built a place where generations of us learned what kindness looked like." I heard someone crying near the back, then another voice, then another. When I finally looked up, Sophie was standing near the pastry case wiping tears from beneath her eyes. For one strange second, she looked young again, not polished, not curated, just my daughter. That evening, someone projected an old slideshow onto the bakery wall after sunset. Photographs flickered one after another, while Christmas lights reflected softly against the windows. There was Sophie in homemade Halloween costumes I sewed after midnight because we couldn't afford store-bought ones back then. There was Tom kissing flour off my cheek before opening hours. There were blurry photographs of exhausted mornings and birthday cakes and crowded holiday rushes, and tiny moments I barely remembered surviving. Beside me, Sophie suddenly whispered, "I forgot how hard you worked." The sadness in her voice nearly broke me, not because she forgot, because I realized I had worked very hard to make sure she could. Later, after most guests left, I stepped outside behind the bakery into the cold evening air. Snow had finally started falling lightly across the alley. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and closed my eyes for one peaceful second. Then I heard Sophie behind me. "Mom?" I turned slowly. Her mascara had smudged slightly beneath tired eyes. For once, she looked emotionally unguarded. "I need to say something," she whispered. I waited quietly. "When I moved to Boston," she swallowed hard. "I felt like everybody could immediately tell where I came from, the way I talked, the bakery stories, the money stuff. I hated feeling judged all the time." Snow settled softly in her hair while she spoke. "And somewhere along the way," she continued shakily, "I started thinking becoming successful meant becoming different from all of it. I looked at my daughter standing under the bakery lights and suddenly saw something I hadn't wanted to admit before. She wasn't cruel. She was scared. Scared of being looked down on. Scared of not belonging. Scared of becoming vulnerable again. I spent my whole life trying to make sure you never felt small, Sophie, I said softly. I just never thought you'd survive by making your own life look bigger without me inside it. Tears slid down her face instantly. Do you think I'm ashamed of you? I held her gaze carefully. I think, I answered quietly. You became afraid of being seen as someone who needed me. The silence after felt enormous, not angry, not healed, just honest. And somehow honesty felt more terrifying than all the pretending ever had. A week after the anniversary celebration, I realized I had stopped rehearsing associations in my head before Sophie called. That had been one of my quietest habits for years, preparing answers in advance, softening my opinions before speaking them aloud, mentally editing stories that might embarrass her. I didn't even notice how exhausting it was until the habit disappeared. Winter settled over Vermont quickly after Thanksgiving. Snow gathered along Main Street in thick white ridges, while the bakery windows fogged every morning from oven heat. The town looked softer under snow. So did my life somehow. Not easier, just more honest. Sophie started visiting more often after the anniversary, though neither of us acknowledged the shift directly. She'd show up early, on Saturday mornings, carrying expensive coffee and standing awkwardly near the register, like someone unsure whether she still belonged somewhere. The first few visits felt fragile, like walking across frozen lake ice before knowing what would hold. One morning I found her in the kitchen trying to frost cinnamon rolls before opening hours. She'd forgotten how messy icing became when it warmed too quickly. You're holding the spatula wrong, I said automatically. She looked up and laughed softly. Yeah, I figured that out. For a moment, flour dusted across the sleeve of her black sweater, exactly the way it used to when she was little. And for the first time in years, she didn't brush it off immediately. That tiny detail nearly broke my heart. Not because everything was magically healed, because healing finally felt possible. A few days later, Sophie sat beside me after closing while I balanced invoices at the kitchen table. I need to tell you something, she said quietly. I looked up. When I first moved to Boston, I lied to people sometimes. My chest tightened slightly. About what? She stared down at her hands. Little things. I'd say my dad worked in business instead of construction. I stopped mentioning the bakery because people made comments sometimes. Her voice cracked softly. And eventually I started acting embarrassed before anybody else could embarrass me first. I stayed silent. I think somewhere along the way, she whispered, I confused survival with shame. The honesty in her voice hurt worse than defensiveness ever had, because now I could finally see the frightened young woman underneath all the polished perfection. Not cruel, just tired of feeling judged. I never wanted you to feel ashamed growing up, I said softly. I know. Tears filled her eyes immediately. That's the worst part. Outside, snow drifted quietly against the windows while the old radiator hissed in the corner. For years, I believed motherhood meant protecting your child from every hard feeling possible. But sitting there across from Sophie, I finally understood something different. Children eventually become adults carrying fears you cannot protect them from anymore. All you can hope is that they remember who loved them before the world taught them to perform. Around Christmas, Arthur invited me to a small winter concert at the community center where he volunteered teaching music classes. I almost said no automatically. The bakery was busy. I was tired. There was always something unfinished waiting for me somewhere. Then I caught myself. You know what? I said slowly. I'd actually love to come. Arthur smiled like he understood the significance of that answer better than I did. The concert itself was chaotic in the sweetest possible way. Children missing notes, tiny violins squeaking, parents crying while filming everything on phones. At one point during intermission, Arthur handed me a paper cup of coffee while snow fell softly outside the lobby windows. You seem lighter lately, he observed. I laughed quietly. I think I'm just less exhausted from trying to be agreeable all the time. Arthur nodded thoughtfully. You know what changes people most at our age? What? realizing we were allowed to take up space the whole time. Something about that sentence settled deep inside me, because for most of my adult life, I'd mistaken disappearing for kindness. I thought love meant shrinking yourself carefully enough that everybody else could feel comfortable. But somewhere between widowhood and motherhood and survival, I forgot that I was still a person too. Not just a function, not just support. Me. A few mornings before Christmas, Sophie arrived at the bakery before sunrise carrying grocery bags and looking half asleep. "What are you doing here?" I asked. She set the bags down dramatically. "Attempting cinnamon rolls." I blinked at her. "You hate baking." "I know." We both laughed. The kitchen filled slow with warmth while snow fell steadily outside the windows. Sophie stood beside me measuring flour too quickly and cracking eggs badly while jazz music played softly through the bakery speakers. At one point, she looked around the kitchen quietly and said, "I used to think this place made us look small." I kept kneading dough without interrupting. "But honestly," she continued softly, "I think this is the only place I ever really felt safe." I stopped moving for a second, not because the words fixed everything, because they told the truth finally. And truth, even late truth, has a way of healing things pride never can. That afternoon after Sophie left, I hung an old family photograph beside the register. Tom covered in flour, me laughing beside him, little Sophie sitting on the counter swinging her legs. For years, I kept that photo tucked away upstairs, because part of me believed polished people were supposed to outgrow visible struggle. Not anymore. The next morning, a young mother came into the bakery holding her daughter's hand before school. The little girl watched me rolling dough for several minutes before asking, "Did you always want to own this place?" I smiled softly. "No," I told her honestly. "But I think this place helped me remember who I was after everyone else needed pieces of me." Later, just before sunrise fully broke across the snow outside, Sophie walked quietly into the bakery carrying 2 coffees. No speeches, no dramatic apologies, no perfect ending. Just my daughter standing beside me in warm kitchen light while flour dusted the sleeve of her dark coat again. This time, she didn't wipe it away. And somehow, that tiny moment healed something enormous inside me. Because sometimes the people we love most don't realize our value until we stop shrinking ourselves to make their lives easier. And sometimes healing doesn't come from finally being chosen. It comes from finally deciding not to disappear. If you've ever spent years giving so much of yourself to family that you forgot who you were for a while, I'd truly love to hear your story in the comments. And if this story stayed with you tonight, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There are so many women carrying invisible sacrifices through ordinary lives. And maybe together we can remind each other that none of us were ever small to begin with.